On November 8, 1519, Mexican warriors cut Hernán Cortés down in a narrow pass beyond Cholula, and the Spanish conquest of Mexico ended before it began. 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of cannon lay scattered across the stones of a highland road, and with them died the timeline we know. For nearly 5 centuries, historians have written the fall of Tenochtitlan as if it were inevitable, a collision of steel and smallpox that no indigenous ruler could have survived. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The true story begins months earlier, in the spring of 1519, when Cortés landed near what is now Veracruz with roughly 500 men, a stable of 16 horses, a few small falconet cannon, and a suspicion that the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, would soon try to recall him. In July, he scuttled most of his ships to keep his men from retreating. By September, he had fought, and then allied with the Tlaxcalan Confederacy, an old enemy of the Triple Alliance. In October, on suspicion of a planned ambush, he ordered the massacre at Cholula, a sacred city of the Mexica tributary world. In Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II had ruled the Aztec Triple Alliance since 150 He was no mystic waiting for a returning god. He was a politician who had spent 17 years extending tribute networks across central Mexico, and coastal runners had been bringing him precise reports since the Spaniards first beached their ships. He knew the range of their cannon, he knew they hungered for gold, and after Cholula, he knew they killed guests. What he did next would change everything that followed. The road from Cholula to Tenochtitlan climbed through passes narrow enough that a column of men had to stretch thin. Cortés knew this. So did Cuitláhuac, lord of Iztapalapa and Moctezuma's most trusted field commander. On the morning of November 8, 1519, as the Spanish column moved through a gorge on the Tlaxcalan side of the highland frontier, Mexica warriors from the Eagle and Jaguar orders closed the pass at both ends. They did not charge. They rained darts from atlatls onto the pack horses first, panicking the animals into the ranks of arquebusiers trying to light their matches. Obsidian-edged macuahuitl cut into the column from above as slingers targeted the gunners. The horses, tangled in baggage and stone, could not break into open ground. Cortés, by the accounts later compiled in Tenochtitlan, fell within the first hour, struck from the flank while trying to form a square. The engagement lasted most of the day. When it ended, fewer than 40 Spaniards were still breathing, most of them wounded, a handful pulled aside alive by captains under explicit orders from Cuitláhuac. The Mexica hauled away the falconets, powder kegs, crossbows, matchlock arquebuses, steel blades, helmets, breastplates, and 9 surviving horses. Cortés himself was carried back toward Tenochtitlan wrapped in a cotton banner, and his head was shown at the border of each tributary province that had wavered. The message was simple, and it traveled fast. For the Tlaxcalan Confederacy, the ambush was a catastrophe disguised as a neighbor's victory. They had gambled their independence on the Spanish captain who now lay dead. Within days, the young war leader Xicotencatl, the younger, faced a council of elders who had already begun to calculate what isolation would cost. Moctezuma did not demand destruction. He offered terms, and they were sharper than any battlefield. Tlaxcala would surrender a portion of its captured Spanish materials, acknowledge tributary status under favorable conditions, and deliver hostages from its ruling houses. In exchange, the Confederacy would be spared the fate of Cholula and granted a guaranteed share of future trade along the Gulf Coast. Xicotencatl argued for resistance. The elders, counting the granaries and the distance to any possible rescue, argued for time. By late December, the Tlaxcalan Council had accepted. The Triple Alliance now stretched, in practice, if not in formal tribute roles, from the Gulf to the Pacific slopes. And the most dangerous political lesson of the Cortés expedition had been absorbed in Tenochtitlan, that an outside power could turn internal divisions into a weapon. What happened next, in the workshops of the island city, would ensure that the weapon itself would not remain foreign for long. The spared Spaniards were not prisoners in the European sense. They were specialists. A gunsmith from Extremadura, 2 crossbowmen, a farrier, and a young arquebusier from Seville were housed near the armories of Tlatelolco and assigned Nahua apprentices who spoke Spanish within a year. Aztec metallurgy had long worked copper, gold, and silver, and Mesoamerican craftsmen already understood bellows, crucibles, and lost wax casting. What they lacked was the furnace heat needed to work iron, and the chemistry of black powder. Both gaps closed more slowly than legend would later suggest. It took nearly 4 years to produce the first reliably functional matchlock built entirely in Tenochtitlan, and saltpeter had to be cultivated from cave deposits and refined through repeated trials. By 1525, however, limited quantities of domestic powder, cast bronze falconets on Mexica carriages, and short steel blades were moving into the hands of selected warrior units. The Triple Alliance did not attempt to replace the Maquahuitl or the Atlatl. It added to them. A company of arquebusiers, supported by eagle warriors, was a different instrument than a Spanish tercio, and it was designed for the landscapes it would actually have to defend. In the spring of 1520, Panfilo de Narvaez sailed from Cuba under orders from Diego Velázquez to bring Cortés to heel. He expected to find a rogue captain entrenched on the coast. He found instead a fortified Mexica position at the mouth of a river north of Veracruz, manned by warriors who knew precisely how Spanish infantry formed up on a beach. The Mexica commanders, briefed by their captive specialists, waited until the landing boats were committed. Then they opened fire with the captured falconets from prepared emplacements. Narvaez lost most of his artillery in the surf and 2 of his 3 landing parties before nightfall. He withdrew to his ships with fewer than half his men and sailed for Cuba, where he died the following year of wounds and disgrace. The Caribbean learned a new word for the mainland. It was not conquest, it was coast. The ambush at the Tlaxcalan border did not cancel biology. Smallpox still crossed the Gulf in 1520, carried by sailors and captives and trade goods, and it still swept through populations with no prior exposure. In the Valley of Mexico, entire districts emptied within a season. Cacamatzin of Texcoco lost 2 of his sons. Cuitlahuac himself fell ill and recovered, scarred. But the Triple Alliance, unlike in our timeline, was not simultaneously under siege. Its granaries held, its causeways remained intact. Its command structure, though grieving, continued to function. The epidemic reshaped the population of central Mexico as profoundly as it did in our history, yet the political system that absorbed the blow was still standing when the fevers passed. Reconstruction began in 1522 under a confederated council that included recovered nobility from Texcoco and Tlacopan alongside the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Something else was standing too, and the Spanish crown was about to realize how much. Charles V had been elected Holy Roman Emperor in June 1519, and his attention in the years that followed was swallowed by the German princes, the French king, and the rising pressure of the Ottoman frontier. Reports from the Caribbean reached his court in fragments. A captain killed in an ambush. A punitive expedition repulsed. A third venture launched privately in 1523 that never returned at all. By 1526, with the treasury drained by European wars and the mainland producing only losses, the crown quietly restricted further conquest ventures from the Caribbean. Hispaniola and Cuba were directed toward sugar, cattle, and legal trade. Licensed contact with Mexica coastal officials was permitted under tightly controlled terms. The vocabulary of the age shifted. Men who had imagined themselves conquistadors now called themselves factors, and the ships that sailed from Havana carried ledgers instead of banners. And then came the decision that would define the Gulf for the next 2 centuries. By 1540, the Triple Alliance had become something the 16th century European imagination had not prepared for, a recognized indigenous power negotiating as a peer. Its coastal flotilla, built from captured Spanish hulls adapted with Mexica rigging and local timber, patrolled the Gulf from Jicalango to the Pánuco. Its envoys spoke Castilian, Nahuatl, and increasingly French, as traders from Normandy arrived looking for dyewood and gold outside the Spanish license system. Castile did not forget the mainland, it simply learned to trade with it. A permanent Spanish factor resided in Veracruz under Mexica jurisdiction, and an annual fleet exchanged iron, wine, and books for cacao, cotton, and silver. Portuguese captains skirted the arrangement when they could. French corsairs complicated it. The Triple Alliance played the three crowns against each other with the same instincts that had once managed tribute provinces. None of this was peaceful in the modern sense. Wars still came over coastal fortresses, over tribute towns, over the borderlands where Tlaxcala still pressed for greater autonomy. But the shape of the Americas in this timeline never compressed into a single imperial map. It remained plural, armed, and negotiated. The past beyond Cholula is quiet now, in any timeline. In ours, it is a footnote to a conquest. In the one we have just traced, it is the place where a ruler chose to strike first, and where the history of two continents bent along a different line. The decision took less than an afternoon. The consequences are still unfolding, in the imagination, 5 centuries later.